In 2024, I got engaged, bought a house, and most importantly, I played video games. It was a curious year for games, where I played less games more often. It started with a back-to-back death march of RPGs, Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, Persona 3 Reload, all of which I was interested in playing, yet all founded on the idea that they'd vacuum away hundreds of hours of my increasingly limited lifespan. I spent 72 hours on Infinite Wealth, 82 hours on Rebirth, and 18 hours on Persona 3 Reload. Around that same time, I dumped 137 hours into my first playthrough of Elden Ring, riding the release of its DLC. That's around 309 hours spent playing 4 video games. 5 video games if we listen to Jeff Keighley. Growing up, I was obsessed with games like Super Mario 64 DS, Super Mario Sunshine, and Toy Story 2. These were games that gave you a number of objectives to complete, all of which held equal weight in regards to your progression. They were like digging through sandboxes for treasure, and I would never settle for any less than all of it. That was an easy approach to take with those games, as fully completing them would never take more than a few hours. As such, I think I grew into the idea that in order to fully experience a game, I had to see everything it offered. Though I often fail to meet this standard of perfection, the fact remains that I still aim for it. Infinite Wealth and Rebirth are lightning rods for this sort of mentality, practically founded on the idea that there's a bucket load of things to do. You better believe I caught all the Sujimon, played every match of Queen's Blood, and won every Chocobo race. Yet, I think about the hours I spent doing those things, and they register in my brain as blank spots. I did them because they were things to do. I look back at a good chunk of my play hours with Rebirth, and realize that I kinda hated a lot of it. I activated every glowing spot on the map, and have virtually no memory of it. Yet, I felt like I'd be missing something crucial if I skipped out on it. Was I going to miss out on the Chadley storyline? Not a chance in hell. In the time it took me to complete Rebirth, I could have played the original FF7 at least 2 more times. It was a similar push and pull with Infinite Wealth as I dove through Kiryu's bucket list. I felt obligated to see it through for him. I saw every single one of his memories, had reunions with every character important to his life. At a certain point, I was doing so much side questing that I lost track of what was even going on in the already fragmented main plot. I look back on these walks down memory lane, these reenactments of more interesting stories, and I began to ask myself whether my time was truly being spent well trying to fully engage with these titles. Perhaps their disappointments would have stung less had I given them the attention my heart felt they deserved. Maybe I could have used those dozens of hours spent on a serviceable parody of Pokemon, playing the dozens of other unique video games released almost every day. That was part of the reason I stopped playing Persona 3 Reload. Persona 3 with a Persona 5 coat of paint was simply Persona 3 again. I wasn't ready to sink 100 hours into a slightly modified version of a story I already experienced and loved. If I wanted that again, I would just go replay that game in the form that I actually appreciate. Shelving that one seemed to better prepare me for Metaphor ReFantazio later in the year, which I dumped 101 hours into. I was pretty happy with that exchange, though, as those additional hours trying to do everything were stressful combat challenges. It was an energy the entire game carried, right up to its final boss, which punished me harder than anything else. It was a brutal playthrough which took me several months of on and off play, and I loved that. It's a somewhat naive story about a group of diverse go-getters trying to make you president and solve racism, but that optimism is infectious. It reminds me a bit of One Piece, another story I love, in which your main cast all have well-realized backstories and dreams propelling them forward. It's likely the closest we will ever get to a One Piece video game, at least in the ways I would want it to be handled. Oddly enough, even though I feel like its finale runs a little long, it didn't really take away from the power of that climax. The most powerful thing Metaphor did, in my opinion, is remind me that fiction is powerful. It isn't about building utopias or escaping from our imperfect lives. It's about inspiring people to take their imperfect worlds and change them. That wouldn't have hit me so hard if I didn't love the journey Metaphor took me on to begin with. Certainly hit me harder than I imagine a remade version of one of my favorite video game endings would have. I think that's why this deluge of remakes bothers me so much. Beyond concerns about preservation, it's hard not to feel like my memories with childhood favorites are being milked for all they're worth. They trotted out the 1,000-Year Door again this year, except it had more graphics, I guess. I played through the whole thing, did every side quest, completed the nerfed Pit of 100 trials, and came away thinking, yeah, that sure is good still. Meanwhile, finally giving Sticker Star an honest chance was far more meaningful and gave me much more to ruminate on, even if it doesn't mean as much to me as the 1,000-Year Door. Remakes just aren't fun to talk about. Discussions surrounding them must focus on the changes they make to the source material, since that's what they are. I don't find those kinds of discussions fun. We all interact with art in wildly different ways. Even the most minute decision in a work could be the reason someone falls in love with it. I happen to love the masochistic allure of the Pit of 100 Trials in the original. One of my favorite challenges is trying to complete it as soon as possible, nabbing powerful badges very early on. The remake dilutes this satisfaction by changing the saving system, thus allowing you to retry every single battle. I think this obliterates the tension of early game pit runs, and turns it into a boring set of 100 battles with zero consequences. An offhand mention of this on the Death website led me to getting swarmed with Doom Eternal memes and told to just not use the retry option. That's not fun. We don't actually want to have discussions about how remakes change the original work. We simply want to fix them. Excise every single one of their pain points, even if those pain points are something someone else held close to their heart and are part of the reason the game even works to begin with, because they were designed around those pain points. But if that's the case, then that person can just go play the original. Stay out of the discussion. You're not welcome. This year, if I've learned anything, it's that playing and discussing remakes is a complete waste of time. No one wants to do it, and quite frankly, it's a soul-sucking distraction from all the other new games I could be experiencing. If I hadn't played a shinier, smoother version of Paper Mario, maybe I could have finished Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown. I could have found the time to start Crow Country, Animal Well, or Mouthwashing. This early foundation for the year had knock-on effects for the rest of the titles I played. Despite really enjoying it, I've only put about 9 hours into Balatro. I love simple card games like poker, and injecting that into a roguelike is an addicting prospect. You'd think it would have dominated my year, but I was oddly resistant to doing more runs past those initial few honeymoon days. Marvel Rivals came out recently, a strange revival of the things I loved about Overwatch back in 2016, yet I've only played a few hours of that. Haven't been particularly compelled to play more. I'm more selective than ever about the hours I choose to spend. I'm more willing to let games sit. I recently tried Nine Souls, and something about it was bouncing off of me. I couldn't really put it into words, other than I just wasn't feeling it. I would boot it up for a few minutes at a time, battling against boredom every play session, before I decided to move on. In previous years, I probably would have powered through. So many people I respect said that the game kicks ass. What if I'm missing out on a new favorite? These questions are silly, and reinforce this unfortunate idea that there's such a thing as a consensus truth to opinions on art. It is entirely possible that I don't appreciate the same things about Nine Souls that other people do. It's even possible that I'm not ready for another Metroidvania right now. Perhaps in the future I'll be in the mood for it. After all, I fucked with Astrobot something fierce. The more I think back on that game, the more I look at it as a lost relic from my childhood, masterfully evocative of so many different platformers close to my heart, washing over me like a warm blanket on a snowy evening. I had a smile on my face flying into every single level as it consistently rose above my expectations of it. That's not because it did anything particularly innovative or new for the genre. I've seen almost all of its ideas before. It was more that every level felt like a story. It took the enshrined mechanical progression of a Mario level, but made those climaxes explosive and memorable. It holds the DNA of every platformer it was inspired by, a little bit of Ape Escape, maybe some Mario, and a bit of Ratchet or Jak for good measure. It's the closest thing we have to a PlayStation history museum. It sounds a bit corporate, until you consider that every now iconic PlayStation icon was once the budding idea of an artist who wanted to share their vision with the world. Diving through PlayStation's storied history, realizing how many games I hadn't played that paved the way for this company's success, saddened me a bit. In recent years, I've done my best to keep up with the zeitgeist of new releases. I want to be part of the conversation, to never feel like I'm missing out. In doing so, I have virtually no time to dive through this vast, beautiful history of video games and find hidden treasures from years that I missed. I love doing these end-of-year videos, but I also feel that they've made it so that if I don't finish a game by the end of the year it came out, I shelve it forever in favor of trying to keep my head above the water of new releases. I do this in part because I want to be able to get to the incredible work so many artists are creating. Not every indie release becomes an Undertale. Dread Delusion, a game inspired by Morrowind, is one of my favorite releases of the year. It's set in a rather bleak world where magic is governed by mathematical equations binding the world together, and people worship Lovecraftian gods grappling with their twisted gifts of immortality. One kingdom is run by what is essentially an AI continuously spouting off an archaic demands, gradually turning its kingdom into a clockwork hellscape. Another kingdom attained immortal life, only to find that they turned into sentient zombies, cannibalizing each other and running flesh farms to counteract the chaos. It's this dreadful push and pull between hope and despair. It's hard not to lose faith in this fractured world you find yourself on, floating above the ruins of a civilization below that annihilated themselves. Nevertheless, you have to somehow muster up the care required to save this hopeless world. It's an Elder Scrolls game with a more limited scope, making even small interactions feel more meaningful as you go spelunking. Like those games, your combat options are limited, as are your dialogue choices, but that also isn't its focus. It would rather give you a spell to run really fast, and eventually hand you an airship to let you explore the skies. What it does well, it does uniquely well. It's unlike games I've played before. I guarantee a decent chunk of you haven't even heard of it. It's destined to slink away into the annals of video game history. Another Crab's Treasure is a Souls-adjacent platformer with a wonderfully well-realized sea creature theme. You play a hermit crab who dons different shells that act as shields, but with special effects. Some of them let you roll down hills like Sonic, some of them give you an extra life, and some of them let you spin around like a Beyblade. Odd as this might sound, it's like a Souls game mixed with a licensed 3D platformer. It has a seemingly cute story with a lot of colorful characters who exist in a surprisingly dire underwater world rotting away from ocean pollution. It's a game about leaving your shell and trying on new ones. Changing the world isn't possible when you hide away on your own, blind to its problems. The oceans are polluted, the planet is dying, and we have to care about that. You cannot have the luxury of only caring about your own interests. It's a wonderful translation of the Souls design, molding it into something more approachable and light, without losing the weight of theming and atmosphere those games championed. Will that, too, be lost to the currents of the ocean? What about 1,000 Times Resist, a game with a story so arrestingly poignant that it kept me up the night I finished it? It let me peer into the horror of the Chinese diaspora, how it creates a cycle of parental neglect and abuse that will cascade into the future, and how those problems aren't so simple as to be vilified. It's a title that forces you to contend with the fact that you are the only person who decides what pain you take with you and what you leave behind. No one can make those decisions for you, and unfortunately, it doesn't all fit in the backpack. It's one of my favorite stories ever told in our medium, and it didn't even get nominated at the Game Awards. It was as if it had never existed. But maybe that's a sign I should stop trying to stuff all these games into my backpack. Keeping up with the waterfall of video game releases is a fool's errand. That's not really a healthy way to keep up with this medium that I love. This year taught me that I can't swim against the current anymore. I need to move with it. I hesitate to say dive through my backlog because I don't formally keep track of one. That can quickly begin to feel like paperwork. With games writing as my job, it's hard not to view certain releases as boxes to check. I need to finish X amount of games this year, or I won't have experienced culture, or whatever. Ironically, in those efforts, I have created something very similar to a backlog. I track the releases of the year and try to make sure I get to them all. In doing so, maybe I've lost track of why I play games to begin with. I've been dipping back into reading lately, something I don't feel like I've had much time to do in recent years. Picked up the Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson, and it has been really nice to simply lose myself in that world. There weren't any expectations for me to do it, no checklist to knock off. I just kinda wanted to. I think that inspired me to check out some games I've always been interested in. I have Dragon Quest VIII installed on my Steam Deck, and I chip away at that every night for an hour or two. Dragon Quest has become the ultimate comfort for me, and that reflects the very slow pace at which I'm working my way through the games. They feel like treats before bed after a long day. They are some of the simplest turn-based RPGs I have ever played, and they know that. As such, it stretches save points thin and focuses on MP management. Every new area you discover is a delight, putting you in the shoes of the characters who are worn from endless random encounters when they finally find an inn to rest at. Bosses are challenging enough to test what few tools you have. Levels are so rare that almost every single one of them is a game changer, often coming with powerful new abilities. If you feel like you have to grind for a boss, you're never but 1 or 2 levels away from an ability that will level the playing field. Since random encounters are tied to a huge overworld, with tons of chests to open and monsters to recruit for another aspect of the game that feels like Pokemon, you can kill 2 birds with 1 stone, grinding while you explore. Importantly though, you never really need to grind. Even in its toughest fights, I never felt completely outmatched. I'd simply hit up the alchemy pot and make great support items, weapons, and armor to even the odds. It is a delightful series of games I have fallen head over heels for, with a soundtrack that is so captivating. It almost makes me forget that the person who composed them denied war crimes. I mean, just listen to this overworld theme. That's some next level adventure whimsy, my lord. If I were to laud any human beings for their work, it likely shouldn't be the war crime denier. It should maybe be the man who crafted some of the best monster designs I have ever seen. Pouring one out for Akira Toriyama, the absolute fucking legend. My turn-based stint didn't end with Dragon Quest though. I also took another massive chunk out of Final Fantasy, finding 2 new favorites in 5 and 13. My love for 13 is mostly documented in my Final Fantasy VII video that you should definitely watch if you haven't, but FF5 was a real shock. I expected to like the game given it works off of 3's gameplay framework. I knew that it was at least going to be fun, but I didn't expect everything to be so fun. Yes, it mastered the job system introduced in 3 with a ton of fun jobs and viable builds. It was challenging enough to make me reconsider my team comp and develop new strategies, making for one of the most satisfying FFs to complete. I've already thought about returning to it so I can try other jobs. Again, what I did not expect was for the story and characters to feel like a D&D campaign drafted up by a group of close friends. Bartz, Lena, Galif, Ferris, and Kryl are a super fun cast to follow. It's a smaller, more intimate group who have a lot of time to bond over even the smallest of adventures. X-Death is a fantastically cheesy villain who always puts a smile on my face. His final boss quotes are some top-tier, stupid bullshit. I love him so much. Yet for as much as I laughed, it knows when to punch you in the gut. One scene in particular hit me much harder than I was expecting and led to a beautiful passing of the torch. It's kind of shocking how effective it was, and that this was 2 games before 7 would do something similar. It's one of my favorite entries in what has become an increasingly varied and diverse set of RPGs. I downloaded Okami HD on my PS5 and will finally be making my way through that with my fiancé, who's a big fan. Perhaps we can both experience this supposed Okami sequel together. I look forward to that day, whenever it should come. A Capcom title I did get to, however, was Resident Evil 7, which was really cool. First-person Resident Evil is the scariest any of these games have ever felt, without skimping on the addicting resource management and difficulty those classic games provided. It's intentionally alluding to that first game, lifting elements from other horror games, like being stalked by the various members of a twisted family. That you cannot see behind you is a brilliant deprivation of your gaming senses, putting you in the shoes of Ethan as he attempts to escape. It's a way to redefine what Resident Evil is, much like the fixed camera angles that made the games distinct to begin with. It has the Metroid-esque map design that I have come to love from the classic titles, and though I hate most of its bosses, it has never been the strong suit of the classic games anyway. I come to Resident Evil to prove myself against a horde of disgusting creatures with a terrifying atmosphere where I am bound to get at least a little bit lost. And Resident Evil 7 was a hell of a fun haunted house. If I had to pick a game of the year, I don't know that it would even be from 2024. Dread Delusion is what my gut tells me, but as great as that game is, I did not become utterly entranced with it the way I did with Elden Ring. I did not regret giving away months of my life to this masterpiece. A Souls game with the most variety in build options, some of the most jaw-dropping art design of any game I have ever played, and a collection of unhinged bosses that completely changed how I viewed these games. It dialed Souls up to 11, but in doing so, shone a light on aspects of the series I had unknowingly been looking away from. My hours spent fighting Radahn and Melania taught me that I enjoy these games as RPGs more than I do as action games, and that was probably the point all along. I had only ever been engaging with these games in the sanctioned form of only using a sword and dodge rolling past attacks. I think the brilliance of these games is that you should not limit yourself. These worlds are hostile to you, they're consistently oppressive, and your response to that unfair world says a lot about how valuable honor is. You could have an honorable duel against the finest warrior that world has ever known, but what if that warrior is a rabid animal that needs to be put down? What if he's a puppet, commandeered by a power-hungry manipulator, gunning for the throne like all the rest? Should you have that honorable duel these bosses increasingly attempt to snuff out? Or will you adapt, experiment, and survive? I have so many memories wandering the lands between, soaking in the dreadful atmosphere, talking with friends, trying to piece the lore together, comparing it with their playthroughs, farming enemies for ridiculous outfits. I think what surprised me the most is that despite being the biggest game I have ever played, almost every hour I put into it was meaningful. Even the silliest of side caves, against a few reskinned bosses, there was always some interesting little nugget of fun game design. Whether that be finding out I could ride a guillotine up to a secret pathway, or realizing one of the catacombs I was in was looping in on itself using clever visual tricks, there was simply never a dull moment in Elden Ring. I became enraptured by its world, and it made me appreciate FromSoft's design ethos in a whole new way. It inspired me to go back and play Dark Souls again. I surrendered myself to it. Those are most of the games I played this year that I have notable things to write for. If I could take a bit more of your time to talk about the channel, I struggled a little more than usual this year. Perhaps it was the year of breaking points and revelations. I have struggled to navigate video ideas in the face of rising costs. As I mentioned, I bought a house this year. I'm getting married next year. A lot of things in my life are changing quite rapidly, and it's made me view this channel as more of a business than ever before. I'm proud of what I made this year, but there's also a very clear divide between the stuff I wanted to make and what I had to make. I still think my Final Fantasy VII video is some of my best work. It's representative of the kind of writing and editing I would like to continue doing. As you might notice, though, I didn't really make anything else quite like it. I threw up a video on Echoes of Wisdom because, well, it was the newest Zelda game. I'm happy with how that video turned out, but it was tough to find substantial things to say about a game I ultimately didn't care for one way or the other. Occasionally, financial and artistic interests merged after I was surprised by Shadow Generations. I had a lot of fun making that video, as well as the accompanying piece I wrote for Nebula detailing my ideal version of Generations. Still, I look back at this year with some regret in my heart. I planned to cover Klonoa and Xenoblade 3 this year. I kept pushing those projects back in favor of releasing more videos to keep making more money, And that is a path I have always wanted to avoid. It also doesn't make much sense in a world where last month, one of my compilation videos blew up out of nowhere and made me more money than I've made in several months. It's just not worth stressing about when it's all been a gamble anyway. I don't want to do that anymore. It's scary not to have control over my primary source of income, but I also don't need to be trapped by it. I'm going to stop trying to feed it. I want to make only the things I can make, and I'm going to do so without looking at those damn numbers. Simply having something out there will keep me living comfortably. I am blessed to be in that kind of position, and I want to take a moment to thank all of you for watching. I appreciate all of you more than words can describe, and I hope I gave you some fun observations to chew on. I have big plans for 2025. I want to transcend my limits and kick myself out of this creative trap I laid for myself. This year I was able to write 30,000 words of a story I'm writing. It was amazing. It reinvigorated me. It was the fire under my ass to assure me that I can just follow my heart and make the shit I want to make. If you like these videos and want to support me in this endeavor, I would really appreciate checking out my work on Nebula. You'll hear some more scripted thoughts about some of the games that came out this year, like Astrobot, TCG Pocket, Balatro, and more. I wrote several videos that are exclusive to Nebula. They weren't videos that would make as much sense to put on YouTube, but Nebula is the perfect place for deeper dives like this. I'm quite proud of my video about the crossover between video games and gambling, which discusses TCG Pocket, Balatro, and other roguelikes. Here's a snippet. There are many video games which include gambling games within them. How many times have you played a game where you eventually reach some kind of casino and get to play poker or blackjack? I can't tell you how much time I've pissed away playing poker in Yakuza, betting all in every single round because it's fun to put fake currency at stake. Other creators, like Liam Triforce, are also part of this service. He just released an amazing video on Chrono Trigger, and he compiled the interviews he did about the game with several cool people, including myself. If you're looking for a few hours of nerds gushing over the meaning of Chrono Trigger and other such deep dives, Nebula is a fantastic site for all killer, no filler. You can watch this and those other videos I mentioned exclusively over on Nebula. No matter where you look, Nebula has fun stuff to watch. Their originals are awesome. Lindsay Ellis released a 1.5-hour deep dive trying to make sense of the X-Men Cinematic Universe timeline, which is surprisingly complicated and fascinating. I highly recommend sitting down and watching this wild ride, and so many others. I can vouch for their quality and originality. That's why I am proud to be a part of Nebula, a streaming service delivering exciting new artistic works. If you're looking to check out what the site has to offer, you can use my link below to check out my channel, as well as my video on how video games promote gambling. Using my link, you'll get 40% off a yearly plan, which shakes out to $36 a year or $3 a month. You could also choose a monthly plan at $6 a month, or go for a lifetime plan for $300. All of this using my link below. New paid subscribers also receive guest passes to give out to others, so if you end up loving it, you can invite friends and family to check it out free of charge. No credit card information required. And for those of you that want to share everything Nebula has to offer with your family and friends, Nebula is now offering annual gift cards. Use the link gift.nebula.tv/KingK to give a year of Nebula to a friend for just $36. I think you'll all really enjoy what Nebula has to offer if you give it an honest chance. It's a bright beacon of creative hope in an increasingly dark and stormy independent creator landscape. So go check it out now at nebula.tv/KingK, and I'll see you there. Hope you all had a great year, and I sincerely hope you have some well-deserved fun next year.